And we're here to go ahead and have John MacDonald give a talk on tonalism now, which is the name of our show. John is featured along with Kurt Hansen. And John, I don't know if you remember this, but so this was the painting that you did. I don't know if can you see that? Oh,
I can now. Yes, I remember it well. Yeah.
That John did when Kurt Hansen died. So John and Kurt painted together for years. Kurt was a little older, so was a mentor. And John wrote, this painting's name is Day's End, in memory of Kurt Hansen, friend and mentor, 2018, John MacDonald. So thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to introduce John, who has been with the gallery pretty much since we started, and is a great painter, and is a joy to come visit, because when I do a trip up north, I see 17 artists in 2 days, and the person I generally see right before I see John drives me crazy. He is disorganized, hard to deal with. You walk into John's studio, everything's organized. He has everything laid out for us, as well he does beautiful work. So he's a pleasure to go meet with in person, and I know you'll enjoy his talk tonight. Welcome to John MacDonald.
Thanks. Hey.
From a very early age, one of my favorite painters, one of the two, was George Inness, who I didn't even know at the time was considered one of the founders of tonalism. So I was a painting art major in undergrad at Washington University in St. Louis, went on to become, or to study printmaking and etching in Avignon, France for 6 months. That was in 1980 and 1981. And then received a graduate degree from Purdue University in drawing and painting. But my soul has always been with painting, and I painted for maybe after graduating and getting married, about approximately 10 to 12 years. At the birth of our first son in 1988, I decided that I needed to contribute more steadily to the family's income. So I switched over to freelance illustration, always painting at the same time. And that served me well through most of the 1990s. Probably as an illustrator, I did a lot of editorial illustration, which is magazines, newspapers. I did a lot of, very small jobs for nominal fees. My biggest claim to fame, if you remember the news magazine, U.S. News and World Report, I did a portrait of President Clinton at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. That was probably my biggest and most high pressure job as an illustrator. In the early 2000s, I finally went back into painting full time. I always used to say that illustration paid the bills, but painting fed the soul. And it was a delight to finally, mostly after maybe the late 2000s, to get back into painting, which I've been doing now solely for about maybe 15 years. I did not know I was a tonalist. I certainly, as a painter, I love painting the landscape. Because of my illustration background, I've always valued good drawing skills. So I still attend a weekly figure drawing class, in which often I draw the portrait, but I rarely paint the figure. It just, as a painting subject, doesn't interest me that much, nor does still life, although I've done those, nor does urban painting. I've always been deeply attached to nature. As a kid, I spent a lot of time camping, and even as a young adult, with friends, we would go up into Canada and take long canoe trips. So for me, nature was both a perfect subject for the painting, but also it was as I think it was Emerson who said, nature is my church. And that's where I felt most refreshed and healed spiritually, mentally, and all of that. So it was only natural that I took to the landscape as a painter. When I was in college, I always assumed that I would paint the landscape and representationally for a certain amount of time, and then I would become a real, quote unquote, artist and go abstract. And instead, the landscape has only become more deeply challenging and more interesting, both in its subject matter and the time of day and the lighting effects, and whether you're painting a meadow or a rushing stream, a sunset, the full sun on a landscape. There's an endless array of subjects with which to deal with, each requiring a different set of a different visual vocabulary and a different way of painting it. So I've never ceased to be enthralled by the landscape. I have always, as I mentioned, one of my favorite artists was George Inness. And when I met Kurt Hansen about 15, 20, I think it was almost 20 years ago now, I was in a gallery in my hometown of Williamstown, and Kurt lived an hour and a half south in Connecticut. He was also in that gallery. And the gallery owner, when I joined it, said, "You need to meet Kurt Hansen," because I had spoken to her of my meditation practice and love of nature. And Kurt, it turns out, had spent 3 months in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand, where he met his wife, Onwarin Hansen. And she just said, "You have so much in common, you really need to meet." So she took me down to his studio and we met. And as soon as I saw his paintings, I was blown away by many, many of the qualities of his work. But mostly, I think it was that quiet, kind of spiritual almost quality that came through his landscapes. He was an avid fan of George Inness, so much so that he had one son, and he named his son Inness Hansen, which maybe is indicative of how much he loved Inness. I love George Inness, but I wasn't ready to name my sons after him, either one of my sons. But it was a treat to meet. It was such a treat to meet Kurt. He always treated me as a colleague, but I saw him as a mentor. He was maybe 4 or 5 years older than I. He is one of the few people I have met, I could probably count them on one hand, for whom painting is their entire life. He painted almost 7 days a week. I might paint 6 days a week, but I also like taking time off. I like hiking. My wife and I travel. I play the banjo. I have other reading interests. For Kurt, painting was his entire life. And he was such a good model for me at a time when I was questioning myself and my abilities and my commitment to painting the landscape. So Kurt was the one, and this was probably in 2012, so maybe just 11 years ago. He recommended to me that I pick up a book written by David Cleveland called American Tonalism, the history of American tonalism from, I think it's I have several copies here in the studio, from the late 1800s to, I think it was 1910. David Cleveland was at that time, not necessarily an art historian, but was passionate about the tonalist painters from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And at the time that they were painting, they were the most popular group in America. They're largely forgotten, but enjoying a true renaissance today, which is great. But Kurt recommended this book to me, and I bought it, and it's a very thick volume, almost 500 pages with over 400 illustrations. And it documents everyone from George Inness, who is considered one of the 4 founders of tonalism, up to modern day artists who were influenced by tonalism. And it was the first time ever I have read a book and looked at work where I felt that I had found my community. I didn't even know I was a tonalist until I found this book. But every page I read, I said, my gosh, that's what I'm trying to express. Every illustration and painting I saw, I thought, yes, that's what I'm trying to say with my paintings. It was truly an epiphany. And then Kurt and I had long talks about the melding of trying to capture a sense of the spirituality in a place, not the religion quality. I know the Hudson River School painters, if you're familiar with Albert Bierstadt or Cole or Church, Thomas Moran, they lived at a time right before the Tonalists, and they were very Christian and very much involved in the philosophy of the manifest destiny that God had given America to the white Europeans. And they celebrated the wildness and beauty of nature by showing every detail and these amazingly dramatic scenes. They were terrific painters technically, but I think that tonalists, the tonalists were much more attracted to the writings of Henry Thoreau, Emerson, Henry James, and the Transcendentalists. So for them, they were much less into the dogma of religion as opposed to the sense of the amazing miracle of nature, the sense that there is a spiritual world lying just behind what we see in nature. And anytime any of us have been, if you've been hiking, canoeing, anytime you see the light on a flower and you feel like a sense of awe, that's essentially what the tonalists were trying to capture, a non-denominational, non-dogmatic sense of the miraculous and the spiritual in nature. So reading this book, as I said, I just was so connected with this. And it affirmed that yes, what I was doing, at least for me, was worthwhile. So most of my paintings, and you can see some behind me, obviously you can see some in the gallery. People will often comment, well, you never put the figure in the paintings. You never put buildings, or rarely put buildings. And in some ways, I do that for two reasons. One is I really am interested in just nature per se. And I know that some people can feel a little uneasy if there's no human reference in a landscape. And I do that deliberately. I like to propose to people that this is what the landscape is like without us. In other words, the landscape doesn't need us to interpret it. It is as it is. And if we open up to it, rather than our projecting our histories, our stories onto it, if we can really open up to the landscape as it is, I think it is a much greater experience and enriches our lives as human beings, one species on one planet, and in this unfolding miracle of nature. I mean, I know that can sound heavy duty, but in some ways, that is kind of what drives me. So the other aspect of including people and buildings, for me, as soon as I see a figure in a landscape or in buildings, it dates it. You look at the buildings and you can tell that this was maybe in Italy or France or the United States. Even if I paint an old barn, then I'm telling a narrative. I'm telling a story that assigns a date and a specific point in time to this image. And I really am striving for the timeless. And George Inness talked about that often. Kurt did too, is trying to capture a moment that's very specific. So a dawn with the light streaking across the lawn, when the sun rises and it's reflecting off a river. So it's a very specific moment, but it's not a moment you can put a date to. It could have happened 10,000, 100,000 years ago, or 100,000 years in the future. As soon as I put a building or a person in it, I'm telling a story, and it confines it to a very narrow period of time. And there's nothing wrong with narrative paintings. The Rembrandt's Night Watch, Van Gogh's Starry Night, the Sistine ceiling. All of those are very rooted in a historical spectrum of human history, and those are fantastic works of art. It's just not what I'm trying to do. So I'm much more interested in capturing a specific moment in existence in nature that is also timeless. And yet, of course, I'm the viewer. I'm painting it so that the human presence is implied because I'm looking at it just as you're looking at the painting. But it's, for instance, I have a dear friend, a terrific friend who I believe, Alan, George Van Hook is in your gallery, correct?
Yes, he is.
Yes. And George does terrific river scenes, but he'll often put a fly fisherman in it. And I would not do that only because of the narrative. George does it because of the narrative, and they're terrific paintings. So it's apples and oranges. It's your preference. I tend to not want to create a narrative. I would rather present present that this is what nature as it is. And this is what we experience as human beings. And sometimes not having that human reference can be unsettling because it takes us, I think, into a much bigger picture. You know, we're on this planet. I'm 66 years old. I'm more aware than ever of my mortality as my knees ache and my back aches as I get out of bed in the morning. So, you know, I'm more aware than ever that we live in a very specific time. But what I see every morning, and I look out my window, as I look at this screen, to either side are two windows, and I'm looking into nothing but trees and green. That's a scene that any human being could have seen, you know, 15,000 years ago. That's a good reminder that there is a larger picture. I hope that my paintings bring a sense of, in some ways, peace and quietude and a greater appreciation of what's there. You know, over the years, I've had some people who've bought my paintings tell me that they've connected with them, but probably the most meaningful interchange I ever had with a buyer occurred maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it was a small painting of a stream, and I was very happy with it. And the buyer purchased it. This was before I joined the lily pad galleries. And he called me out of the blue. He didn't live far. And he asked me, he said, "What is this painting about, really about?" And I said, well, in some ways, it's about time and death, because I'm entranced by this passage of time in nature, which happens on such grand expanses, and our lives are so brief. So you can't begin. And I think George Innes, I think, would have agreed, because he was such a spiritual person, and he probably would have said, yes, I'm trying to capture the timeless, but we don't live in timelessness. We live in time, and therefore our lives are brief. So I told him it's both about timelessness, but also about death, which is a point in time. And he said, well, that's funny you say that. He said, because I bought your painting, I was diagnosed with terminal leukemia 4 months ago, and I've only been given 2 months to live. And he said, I saw your painting and it brought me such peace. That was the most meaningful comment any buyer has ever given me. Because I think for me, that captured exactly what I was trying to. Not only that, but I'm aware that, yes, he had 2 months to live. Well, how much time do I have? I could have a week, I could have a year, maybe 20 years. I don't know. None of us know. So and that's a rather depressing way to, I guess, to talk about my work. But that's the dark side, if that is. I don't think it's a dark side. I think it's just the real side. But on the other side too is technically, I've fallen in love with light, and maybe light is part of that transition that in time, any time. So I paint both in the studio, but I also paint plein air, which means on location. And when you paint outside on a landscape, you might have 2 hours to paint at most, because the sun will move in those 2 hours. Shadows change, colors change. Again, it's a reminder of transition and transience. There's a moment of beauty, and you need to capture it. The advantage of painting in the studio is then, of course, I have days, weeks, quite a long time to paint and really fine tune the painting. But I enjoy both. I don't consider myself a plein air painter, because my painting process tends to be slow and deliberate rather than very fast and impetuous, which allows you to capture a finished painting within a 2-hour period.
Which is George, by the way.
There are two things, but I do plein air paint quite a bit on location, because I feel it's such good training. The camera can never capture the color in nature. So I'll often on location go out and take photos, do a plein air painting just to get the color and do some sketches, come back in. And I believe most of the paintings, I'm sure most of the paintings in the gallery that you're looking at now at the Lily Pad in Milwaukee are studio paintings. So I do both. I think I tend to really labor over the studio paintings because I have the luxury of time. I'm not limited to those 2-hour periods in which the light can change. And of course, I'm not also bothered by mosquitoes and heat and noises and all those things that can make plein air painting so much more difficult. I do that often. Yes, I will do that. If the painting at the end of a 2-hour session plein air is, I come home and I'm happy with it, yes, I will often touch it up. And I learned that from Kurt, which was interesting because the first year or two I was painting with Kurt, I would be painting next to him. We're painting the same scene. And I would look at Kurt's painting and often I would think, well, Kurt, that's not your best work. You know, that wasn't your best day's work. And the next day he would post the image online and I would look at it again. I'd say, my gosh, that's a stunning painting. And it took me a while to realize that he made very few changes to it. So he would often go out and paint plein air for 2 hours and just block it in, get the essential large shapes and the large color masses. And that's what I was looking at and thinking, well, if this is a finished painting, I don't know if this is really working well or not. But he told me that anytime he worked plein air, he would take it back to the studio and immediately work on it again while the memory and the feelings, the emotions, the sense of that scene were all fresh in his mind. So, and what used to amaze me when I would look at the painting, I would look at his painting when we finished painting that day and then see it the next day, is that he would often it would be a streak of light, a couple details, softening one edge. He would do so few things to it to make the painting just work so well. So yes, I do often start paintings outside, finish them in the studio, and then I also use them as studies for larger paintings. Almost all my larger paintings are done in the studio. I find it just too impractical to try and work large outside because of my painting process, which tends to be much more slower than a lot of, for instance, George Van Hook in the gallery. If you look at his paintings, they're so energetic. He's a terrific plein air painter, paints energetically and captures that sense in a very brief period of time. I'm much more slower, deliberate. I'll block it in, take photographs, sketches, a plein air to sketch, and then create a much larger painting. I do. I'm looking around the studio. I don't have an example at the moment, but so typically when I do smaller paintings, I will often, I have 2 monitors in the studio. One I'm talking through, obviously, but another near the easel. There are plein air purists who say you have to paint from life. There are some who paint only from photographs. I like doing both. And I think as an illustrator, I learned that anything visual is visual material. The point is to make a painting, not to document what we see. So when I go out and paint plein air, I'm still changing things. I might have to move a tree, lighten something, invent a streak of light to make the painting work. So that's my first goal, is to make a good painting, not just to capture what I see. One artist, I can't remember his or her name, said that we're artists, we're not police reporters. You know, if you remember the old Dragnet TV series that I used to watch in the late 60s as a kid, you know, only the facts, ma'am, you know, that I can't remember the name of the detective, just give me the facts. And that's not what painters should be doing. I mean, we're creating a painting, we're inventing a painting. So we're using that as raw material. So in terms of my process, I will work from either photographs or life when I go plein air. If I'm working on a larger painting, and I know that Alan has several larger paintings in the gallery right now, what I will do is gather that visual material. I'll have a plein air sketch or two, painting or two. I will make sketches in photographs. I will pull them all out. When I'm trying to design and compose the painting, I will often, if you'll excuse me 1 second.
Behind you. Back up the left, that's what he does.
I keep a lot of sketchbooks, and I will often, and I'll find just a couple examples here. I will often do a tonal study. Well, these are a trip from Europe. Let me see if I can get something a little more pertinent. Let's see. I think I had one a couple of pages ago. So I will often do tonal sketches. This was actually scenes in when we were in Italy. But if I'm painting, I will quickly do very small, some tonal sketches, which allows me to work out the composition and the lights and the darks. So by doing these black and white sketches, I can very quickly go through a variety of ways to compose the scene. Do I want to make it vertical? And much of it is my intention. What made me fall in love with this scene was that the light across a field and this distant glow in the hill. Well, if that's what interests me in the scene, I have to make sure that that is what we call the focal point of the painting, where your eye will eventually go. So there is a message in the painting, and it often can be a certain effect of light that enhances the mood, because I'm more of a mood painter than a story painter. So as I work through these sketches, I will find and often they can be quite small. I'm looking for both a good composition and then what we call a value structure, which just means the composition is made up of the biggest shapes, the sky, the land, maybe a hill, 3 or 4 shapes, but those shapes have value, which is a light or dark. So if it's a sunset, the sky might be light and the ground very dark. So those would be the 2 shapes I have to deal with, one light, one dark. So I'll go through a series of sketches to design that to what I think will make a good painting. Often then, especially with the largest paintings, I will do what is called an underpainting, which I think I have one here, which I should be able to grab. Let's see, without killing myself.
It looks huge.
So this is a very large, long, narrow underpainting. But it's a winter scene, actually almost looking out my studio. So it's monochromatic. It's painted, although in the way the image looks, it looks like maybe it's cool and slightly warm tones. It's actually entirely monochromatic. So in a large painting, I will take the panel, and I usually work on panels, and reproduce that scene strictly in one color. And the point of that is to really, again, fine-tune the composition so I know exactly where these different shapes are, but as well the lights and the darks in the scene. And it allows me to even get into some detail if I want to. Having done that, and if it's working, all I really have to do, it sounds easy, but of course it's not, all I have to do is add color. So in that case, for a larger painting, I'll begin to add glazes of color. Invariably, I end up changing things. Certain color effects will happen I hadn't anticipated. Maybe I had intended to have your eye go here where there's a light on the hill, but now I'm more interested on the pattern of light through the trees. So I move the eye there by enhancing contrast between light and darks and stronger colors and sharper edges. Sometimes an edge can be, for instance, I'll just throw this up. Sometimes an edge, for instance, the edges in here can be quite soft. So those trees go back in space. Here I'm popping some of the edges against the lights and the darks, which attracts the eye. So, I know that, when I was young and really in love with art and wanted to be a painter, I thought it was all magic. And I thought it was all dependent on talent, and talent certainly helps, but hard work and perseverance beat talent any day. And a lot of it is, it's not rocket science. If you have any inkling to paint, please do. It is something that you can learn to do. So back to my painting process, I would start to lay color on those paintings. Often they need, if it's thin layers, they need to dry. So I would let them dry for a week. Again, that's the difference between plein air and in my process in the studio. Plein air, you really want to finish a painting in 2 hours. I will have a painting that's finished in 2 or 3 months. And I learned to be comfortable with that through Kurt Hansen, who used to use the term incubate. He said two things. He said, number one, if you don't know what the painting needs, you need to stop. Which was brilliant advice, because there's an expression among painters, poking and hoping, where you're not sure what the painting needs, so you're poking at it and you're hoping it works, and often it doesn't. So Kurt would say, if you don't need to know what the painting needs, you just stop. And he would say, let the painting incubate. And I can remember once visiting Kurt in his studio, and he pulled out a painting and he said, this has been sitting around for a year and I'm not really sure what it needs. What do you think? And I put out a couple lame ideas, but at least I think it triggered his thinking. And he said, oh, well, what if I did this? And sure enough, a week later, he showed me the painting and he made a couple little changes and it was perfect. It was beautiful. So he was very comfortable with letting a painting sit for a year before going back and hitting that final note. I think several things would be characteristic of my work and Kurt's and tonalism in general. One is suggestion rather than description. And by that, I mean the Hudson River School painters would give you every leaf on every tree, and the painting is loaded with detail everywhere. That doesn't make it a bad painting. It just makes it a different painting. And Kurt and the tonalists and myself, I'm much more interested in painting more loosely and suggestively, which I think allows the viewer to finish the painting in his or her mind in some ways. And it leaves some sense of mystery and even ambiguity in a painting. What is that exactly in that corner of the painting? Oh, that could be this, or it could be that. I think that that's more interesting for a viewer than if I gave you every detail and described every leaf on every tree. Which is what I had to do as an illustrator. Everything had to be clear, and which is why it eventually bored me to death. I like the little mystery and suggestion and suggestiveness. And it also allows for me, when I'm painting, for mistakes to happen and things to be ambiguous to me when I'm painting. Well, what exactly is this that I'm painting? It was a bush, but now it starts to look instead like something else, or maybe a streak of water on the landscape. Well, maybe I'll make it that. I've learned a long time ago that there are no wrong answers in art. They're just wrong paintings in some ways. So as I would paint, just to be open to a mistake that would take a painting in an entirely different direction. I've started paintings that I meant to be a fall scene and have ended up by making some of the leaves, say, too light and too bluish. Suddenly it started to look like snow, and I went with that. And suddenly it ended up being a winter scene. It's the process of creation that I love. There are viewers maybe who want it to be exactly what I see, but none of us see the same thing. I've been to so many events where there are 10 or 15 really terrific painters all painting the same scene, and every painting is different. We paint differently, we see differently. So for me, the paradox of painting is, I think my paintings become most universal when I'm most selfish about insisting that I paint the way I want to paint and paint the way I see, and not trying to tailor it to the general, public. Because I think when I do that, it's much more authentic and it's much more likely to resonate with the viewer, because you've probably seen that scene the same way, but it makes you look at it maybe slightly differently and hopefully more richly. Well, I will say that so I'm in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, but I grew up in Indiana and painted it. We used to vacation in northern Wisconsin around Minocqua and all the lakes up there all the time. And in fact, my brother lived in Madison. My mother and father both retired, went up north in Wisconsin down to Madison. In other words, I know Wisconsin very well, and it's not unlike the area in which I live, rolling at least west of Madison in Vermont County, and even around, I know Milwaukee, you get those flat farmlands. Well, where I grew up in Lafayette, Indiana, it's flat farmlands as well. So they're similar visually, they're very similar. By the end of summer, I'm tired of grains. It's monotonous grains. I love winter. And winter in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts is not unlike the winters, I think, in the hillier parts of Wisconsin. Pretty cold and a lot of snow. And it's a beautiful time to paint outside because there are no bugs and usually no tourists to bother you. And it's extremely quiet, which is so as long as it's not too cold. I do like winter. I love fall, painting fall, but I know when the color is at its peak, and I know much is made of New England autumns with the brilliant colors. But I've seen brilliant colors in northern Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin that are every bit as brilliant. I tend not to like to paint landscapes with a color that saturated. So I do love right before autumn, or really one of my favorite times is right post-peak, where there will still be maybe the larches that are still gold, or you'll have the beeches starting to go brown gold, and yet there are a lot of bare trees which can be quite purplish and brown, and there are these beautiful passages of warm and cool kind of neutral tones, and spring is wonderful. So I guess I love every season. The only season that I do tend to tire of is probably mid to July to August, where everything is so green. And I love green when it first comes out in June, but after 6 or 8 weeks of just mixing nothing but greens, it gets a little old, frankly. That's interesting because I play the 4-string banjo, a traditional banjo, in a Dixieland band. And I've known a lot of artists who also play music, and we talk about the relationship between music and visual arts, how music is inherently abstract. Even, say Debussy's La Mer, where he's trying to imitate the crash of a waves, it doesn't sound like a crashing wave. It's symbols, and we all understand that, but we understand the symbol behind that. So music is inherently more abstract. And I listen to music when I paint, but I will say I learned and I like opera and classical music. I can't listen to it because it engages my mind too much. I certainly can't listen to rock and roll that I grew up with because I like it still, and it immediately distracts me from painting. So I do tend to have music playing, but it's very often very quiet, either very quiet classical music or what they even call ambient, not necessarily the stuff you hear in elevators. It's a little more sophisticated than that, but it seems to enhance the mood.
We have another artist, Christopher Groves, from Charleston, and he says 2 things about his work. One, in his paintings, actually, he will show time transpiring, and he will actually have different moments of time in the same painting, which I could see in his paintings. I could actually see time in Chris's paintings. He also, when he was here, said he has music in his paintings, like you were just describing. And for the life of me, I tried. Yeah. I looked, and I'm thinking, all right, Chris, I'm going to go find the musical notes. I'm going to go have the feeling of music in the painting. And I've yet to be able to experience that. In all his work, there really is a view of time. He does a Serengeti painting that literally shows, the day transpiring. Right. It's a phenomenal painting, but I can never hear the music. So some artists say it's there. I haven't found it. And I've been looking since Chris told me that story the last time he was here about 8 months ago.
Yeah. I think if anything, although I enjoy music and listen to it, I think what I try and capture is silence. The lack of not only music, but any sound other than maybe, the wind, the sound of water. Yeah, silence. I love trying to, it's not my goal. It's not my intention when I started painting to capture silence. But if I do feel a sense of silence in some of my paintings, I enjoy that. I think it ties in beautifully with the sense of timelessness, because music unfolds like a story does. It has a beginning and it has an end. And again, it roots you in time. And I still love to have a sense of timelessness in a painting. And I think to capture that, nothing captures it more than a sense of silence, which has no beginning and no ending. Both as and thank you for the question. Yeah, I went through that both as an illustrator and a painter. I think what I learned is that you tend to do your best work when you do what you want to do, something that connects with you, deeply. I mean, I don't want this, to make this sound, too profound, but there is I learned a long time ago that I have to do work that is meaningful to me, because if I do, I'll do my best work. As an illustrator, I did a lot of mundane jobs. I mean, I was being hired for my hands, and that was it. And it was hard to put I rarely put my heart and soul into an illustration, because the subject just didn't mean anything to me. The painting was the opposite. So I would say that the key as a painter is to follow your heart, your soul, your desire, and then find the market. Yes, your local gallery, and there are galleries I've walked into that handle nothing but abstract work, and they're good galleries, but I know immediately they would never touch me with a 10-foot pole, because I don't do that kind of work. And that's good to know on both our parts. So I'm very clear that this is the kind of work I want to do. Then I have to find a market for it. But I think that ultimately that really is the most important thing to do, is do work that means a lot to you. When you see my paintings on the walls of a gallery, what you're not seeing are the 10 failures that preceded that, and the 50 failures that preceded every painting 10 years ago. And in fact, I think the only difference between a beginning painter and a truly experienced painter is the experienced painter knows when to give up on a painting earlier. So I don't waste my time on a painting I start and immediately know it's going to fail. So my success rate is higher, but it doesn't mean I don't produce a lot of garbage. I mean, garbage. In my view, failed paintings. I have probably 200 paintings sitting in my studio that I'll eventually paint over. So Alan gets the cream of the crop, right, Alan? but every gallery does. I mean, any gallery does. I only want to show my best work, because my best work is what conveys, my heart, my message, the soul, whatever, more clearly and more succinctly. So you'll do a lot of bad work. When you do a lot of good work, when you have a body of good work, then find the market for it. Invariably, people react to that. Van Gogh, we all worship him now, but he sold one painting his entire life. And yeah, it was, I don't think I would want to have lived his life, because it clearly was very difficult. But by the same token, he did show that if you paint from your soul and heart, you're going to paint authentic work. And there are so many good painters out there who can crank out a painting that looks okay. And in fact, I'm a great painter at making mediocre paintings if I wanted to. So if I just wanted to go for the market, I could do that. And any painter with a certain number of skills could do that. Paint from your soul, and then find the market for it wherever it is. And talk to Alan. Alan is very savvy. He can tell you, he can give you advice. I've often talked to the gallery people I'm in and saying, I'm kind of going in this direction. What do you think? And they might say it's great work, but we can't sell it. Okay, then maybe I could do both. And there's nothing wrong with doing work that is more marketable if you enjoy it. And I like doing a lot of maybe water scenes and light scenes filled with light, and the galleries love it. But I also do a lot of work on the side that I jokingly refer to as my doom and gloom style. I could probably pull one out. I've been playing around with a way of painting with layers and So it's very dark and you know, kind of gloomy. Is there a market for it? Well, at this moment, I have no idea, but I'm going to continue to develop it.
There definitely is. I'm going to tell you right
well, that's good. I'll ship you 50 of them tomorrow.
The doom and gloom. I got hands up already.
Okay.
Got hands up. I'm looking at collectors in the gallery. Got hands up.
Color is I don't want to turn this into a workshop, but yeah, color is tied into light and dark, and color is so relative. If so, I would suggest at some point, if you want to, go to a museum and take with you a piece of paper with a hole cut into it, maybe 2 holes, and hold it up so you can look at 2 different parts of the painting and shift it around, and you can see how color can change depending on what's next to it or what else you're looking at. But also colors, if you have 2 colors, one very light in value, so it's very light, and one very dark, like a very dark green and a sky blue, what the eye really sees is that difference in light and dark and less color contrast. But what Monet does, and if you look at any painting by Monet and just look at one area like a sky, he'll have 13 colors, but they're all exactly the same light or dark. And by bringing the values, the light and dark colors together, that's what creates color contrast. That's what can make colors look extremely different. So the times I've you know, for instance, painting snow, what I've learned is that if I just put a single color down in snow, blue, it starts to look like blue snow, as if not the snow's not white in shadow, it's just blue. But as soon as I can start adding more color, but not changing the light or dark, it's exactly the same value. You get this sense of translucency, transparency, and it shimmers. And the artists in about the late 1800s, they called that vibration, where it's color contrast. So it's again, there's a lot that goes into a painting that seems like magic, and it's almost like I hate to be the person to pull the curtain off the Wizard of Oz and show it's just this old guy back there pulling levers. But in some ways, even the greatest painting, you can break it down into how they handle color, light, and dark. And it doesn't mean I can paint like Monet, but it does mean that I can understand what he did in his paintings, and how he structured those paintings. The mood that you get from it. So if you connect with the painting, that certainly is a connection that comes through the technical aspects of how I handle light and dark and color. But a lot of that is just, what is mood? I mean, when I paint a painting and I'm putting my soul into it, there's not a tube of paint. I don't pull out a tube of paint that says quiet, or a tube of paint that says meaningful or powerful or whatever. It's all just pigment on canvas. That's the magic, I guess. And so you will look at a painting of mine and absolutely fall in love with it. And for that, I bless you. But someone else will look at it and say, oh, this is old stuff. Why were you bothered painting that way? And there's room in art for both. I don't take these paintings personally, because I do so many paintings that I end up scraping or changing. It's, for me, I say it's just another painting, and yet it's a lot like our children, right? If you have children, you love them dearly, but when they leave the house, they're on their own. But imagine having 2,000 children. Well, some of them you'll just get rid of without a second's thought. There are times my 2 sons, I would have loved to have kicked them out of the house, but I didn't. But, it's like a painting, just scrape it, start over again. But the paintings are like that. You produce a lot of work, you put your heart and soul into it, and those magical times where it really works, when it moves someone else and there's that connection, that's what makes it worthwhile for me. Yeah. And I don't expect everyone to connect with my work, because everybody's different. And some people will connect with art that doesn't move me, and that's fine. There's room enough for everyone.
Well, I really thank you for that, and thank you. Keep painting and making mistakes and fixing them and all the stuff that you do. Because
Well, thank you. I will. I'll keep making mistakes. I know that.
but then you fix them or you don't. I mean, it just depends.
Yeah.
All the orphan paintings to kind of work on too. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate your following the work and your interest in my work. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, you can go to my website, which is www.jmacdonald.com. And I write a newsletter that's I put out once every 2 months, and I will toot my horn here. I'm not one to usually toot my horn, but Eric Rhodes, who publishes Plein Air magazine, Fine Art Connoisseur magazine, and puts on the best art events in the country for plein air painting, has said publicly that my newsletter is the best in the industry, for what that's worth. It is a how-to newsletter really for painters, but if you love my work, you'll learn probably more about it. But it's all about, how I want to paint trees against the sky. How do I do that? And I'll break it down. I will say that 2 months ago, just to show you that old dogs can learn new tricks, I was the chairman for the show of the American Tonalist Society, has a biennial show in New York at the Salmagundi Club on Fifth Avenue. I was the chairman for the show. It was a terrific show, 64 paintings by 32 artists. And there's a terrific artist named Dennis Sheehan who gave a demo. And I learned some techniques from him. So it's kind of changing the way I'm painting. So even, we all learn, the learning never ends. If I ever get bored with painting, it's going to mean I've become a formula painter and I've lost that connection to my, heart and soul. So you got to keep learning and failing. Failing is so important. It's how we learn. It's such an important part of painting is producing bad paintings. And I think it was Matisse who said, if you want to produce a few great paintings, you have to be willing to produce a lot of bad paintings. And it is so true. It is so true. So producing a bad painting means nothing to me anymore. It's just I painted, it didn't work. Okay, on to the next one.
So a sidebar, Dennis Sheehan was originally part of the show.
That's right. That's right. He was.
He got caught up in another show. I got mad at him, and so he's not in the show. But we do have some works by Dennis. So he's a great painter, and he does paint. He's a great tonalist painter, frankly, and he's a friend of John's. We love him very much, and we'll show you some of his works as well. He did send us stuff after the show started, but that's why he's not in the show. But
yeah, very terrific painter, and such a nice guy, and so willing to share everything.
Yes.
Yeah, great painter.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful hour plus.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to getting into Milwaukee again and being in the gallery.
Well, we love that. We love that, and we'll certainly see you probably out east in the next by the end of the summer. So we'll be out there again.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you for watching.
Thanks. Good night, John. Thank you again.
Thanks, Mark, for checking in. Bye-bye.
Yeah.